Hi, I'm Rajiv.
Hi, I'm Venkat.
And this is Dharmology. Namaste, Venkat.
Namaste, Rajiv.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Venkat, I've heard that Brahmins are hated. Is this real? Or is this all made up?
Rajiv, this is very real. The hatred for Brahmins exists in India as well as in the West and here in the United States. It's and it has, it increases over time and then it diminishes slightly, but it always resurfaces. Whenever there's an attack on Hindus or Hinduism, you can be sure that the Brahmins are bearing the brunt of it. You can think of it as they are the favorite whipping boys.
So what's the history of Brahmin hate or anti-Brahminism, if I may use the term? So first of all, is Brahminism anything at all? I've seen that term being used. I personally, the first time I encountered it about 4 or 5 years ago, was surprised that I had not heard it before. I've seen people use it, and I'm not sure. So the question, is there something like Brahminism?
The short answer is no. Brahminism is a term that's been coined by certain segment of Indologists to try to portray Hinduism as a construction by Brahmins. They argue that there was no such thing, and the Brahmins basically created it, and created in such a way to privilege themselves. So there is no such thing as Brahminism. There is only Hinduism.
So if I were to also look at it as a strategic anti-Hindu move, perhaps calling out Brahminism or coining that term when conceptually that idea does not exist, is perhaps a good way to fragment the Hindu society. What do you think about that?
That is exactly the intent. It is the aim of that approach is to fragment the Hindu society and to attack the sort of thought leaders, if you can say, to attack them, to demean them, to make them out to be opportunists, so that that can then destabilize all of Hinduism, and that's the idea, basically.
Now, coming back to this whole idea of hatred against Brahmins or Brahmin hatred, can you tell us a little bit briefly about the history of it? When did it start? Or rather the noticeable historic aspects of Brahmin hate?
Sure. So the hatred for Brahmins was originally fomented by the colonists. So both the British colonists as well as the Islamic colonists. And it continued subsequently by what I would call the Christian fundamentalists, who translated and interpreted the various literature that was present in the Vedic system of thought. And their interpretations were heavily influenced by, one, their own belief system about non-Christians. and it was also influenced by their viewpoint that if the Brahmins can be, if a division could be created between the Brahmins and the rest of the castes, as they refer to it, then Hinduism can be destabilized and destroyed. And so this is the sort of the historical context, but I'm not talking here about sort of modern history. I can go into that if you want, in the last, I would say, since independence.
Earlier, you talked a bit about Brahmin hatred being prevalent in India as well as in the United States or in the West. Can you give us some examples of what anti-Brahmin activity looks like, let's say, in India? How can one spot it? And what forms and shapes, not just in society, but also in policy making, does it take?
Sure. So in India, Brahmin hatred is readily apparent in a state like Tamil Nadu, where the ideology on which the two main political parties of that state, the ideology to which they prescribe is an ideology that demonizes Brahmins and views them as foreigners or not originally from the state of Tamil Nadu, a foreign, people with a foreign culture. And that used to be sort of very prevalent, and I think its peak was in the 60s and 70s, when there used to be, these political goons would go out and try to look for Brahmins and older Brahmins and cut off their sacred thread or do demeaning things like that. And then today, the modern day version of that is, if you look in the Tamil movie industry, they will make movies where certain scenes will be aimed at demeaning Brahmin culture. They would purposely place a Brahmin character in a situation where he will either be insulted or she will be insulted or demeaned in some way or another. And this is very, very prevalent. There are many videos on YouTube that illustrate this, where Brahmins have identified these and highlighted them as examples.
Wow. I was not aware that in a country and society like India, with the piety that I would associate with Tamil Nadu, that there would be a movement, an organized movement to cut off sacred threads of Brahmins. That is astonishing. And I wonder what else do we not know about Brahmin hatred, given what I just learned.
Another example is, I think there's a person, a prominent anti-Brahmin figure. His name was Periyar, and he is the inspiration for the political parties in Tamil Nadu. And he had written many, given many speeches and written many articles that attack Brahmins. And he's the inspiration for a lot of the anti-Brahmin activity. And in terms of policy, there is what I would call vile affirmative action in states like Tamil Nadu, where seats are reserved for various castes other than Brahmins, and the Brahmins are essentially forced to compete for a very small segment of seats in universities, whereby it's almost impossible for them to secure admission unless they're the cream of the crop. And so, it's a explicit discrimination against Brahmins, and because they're a super minority in the state of Tamil Nadu, they do not really have a political voice, and no one speaks on their behalf.
Growing up, going to school in India, I remember at one point, and I may be a bit off in my numbers, but I think in Tamil Nadu, the reservation or the educational quota, as I choose to call it, was at about it was an astonishingly high number, something like 70% or 80%. And to me, that was surprising. Am I in the right range here?
Yes, that is very correct. And, anecdotally, and we can perhaps in a subsequent podcast, I can get the actual data, but I think it's even higher than that, in the sense that it's almost impossible for a Brahmin to get into a government college or a government school, because the quota is so stringent that it's an explicit form of discrimination against the Brahmins. And the same is true in government jobs. So if you're a Brahmin and you're a scientist and you work, at an organization, your promotion opportunities are limited because you're a Brahmin. So, there are many, many forms of discrimination against Brahmins. And these are, I wouldn't call them subtle. They're explicit. And nobody calls this out because they think of these quotas as helping the underprivileged. But in today's India, the underprivileged are the Brahmins. The vast majority of Brahmins are very poor in the state of Tamil Nadu. Mm. I have witnessed this myself on my last trip to India. When I went to visit several temples, I've seen Brahmin, poor Brahmins and Brahmin priests who work in very small temples, essentially begging for money. It was very painful to witness that.
Right. Along the same lines, in Uttar Pradesh, in UP, in North India, pretty much through the decade of 70s and 80s, the chief minister of the state, the ruling party, was a Brahmin. So Kamlapati Tripathi or Narayan Dutt Tiwari, and I'm missing a few names here and there. But what that led to was that once the 90s rolled around, there was this very open purge of the Brahmins, and the pretense was to take the power away from Brahmins. So in other words, we don't want any Brahmin like Narayan Dutt Tiwari or Kamlapati Tripathi, or any Brahmin for that matter, to be the leader. And the power was deliberately shifted to non-Brahmins. And it just so happened that with the affirmative action movement that was shepherded by VP Singh in India also gave rise to Bahujan Samaj Party, led by Mayawati and her mentor Kashi Ram, and they openly purged Brahmins. That basically meant not giving Brahmins promotions in police force or administrative services, not allowing Brahmins to run for elections, and many other forms. So I'm aware that there was quite a bit anti-Brahmin sentiment in India in the 90s and even in the decade of 2000. but I think Tamil Nadu takes it to yet another level altogether.
Right. And
Go ahead.
I was just going to say it is, the Brahmin is the favorite whipping boy, both in India and the West. And with some, just, if somebody looked into it a little bit, even put a little effort, he or she can quickly determine that a lot of it is pure propaganda. The Brahmins are not privileged economically or politically, and have essentially never been privileged. Because if you really understand what the role of a Brahmin in society was, you will understand that the Brahmin was supposed to be focused on education, spiritual education, mainly, and teaching. And they were also supposed to, there was a lot of responsibility for a Brahmin. He or she was not supposed to pursue material wealth. And the ones that were very orthodox basically shunned wealth, the material wealth and material possessions, and basically, generally lived in a separate place called an agraharam. And they had very minimal possessions. And they had this practice of going out daily to gather grains for their daily consumption through, basically, it's called uncha vritti. So basically, going out and begging for alms, right? So so I don't know where this notion that the Brahmin was privileged comes from. There's, there may have been a few Brahmins that were wealthy, but the vast majority who were practicing Orthodox Brahmins shunned material wealth and focused on education.
I think it certainly can be said that as the opportunities multiplied, as the society became more mobilized, or as mobility increased, as job opportunities and money earning opportunities increased, I think certainly a lot of Brahmins took to commercial pursuits or financial pursuits even, which took them away from their ceremonial responsibilities and spiritual responsibilities, as you alluded to, and therefore, for all practical purposes, were like others when it came to living a normal life in the city with family and kids going to school and building a house and owning a business. However, I would say that the expectation, the purge that they had to go through, not openly, but as an undercurrent in society, the alienation, the diatribe against them certainly was much more, it is not warranted just because they are Brahmins. And
right.
Go ahead, please.
So to add something there, what I wanted to say was what you're pointing out is absolutely correct. The Brahmins, over time, especially in the last 100 years or more, moved away from their original role into more secular society and pursuing material things. But that has nothing to do with their privilege. They didn't enjoy any benefits, right? That has nothing to do with them being the upper caste. It had something to do with them kind of shifting away, just like all segments of society over time in India have been moving away from spirituality towards material pursuits. The Brahmins also made that movement. But their I would say the elevated status of a subset of Brahmins in terms of educational attainment from a secular sense and material wealth has nothing to do with the fact that they're an upper caste or so-called upper caste. That's the point I wanted to make.
Correct. Both you and I know that there is a very deliberate and well-organized movement to fragment, to break up India in the West. And we are kind of aware that the route to breaking up India, or one of the steps in break up India movement is to destroy the Hindu identity or diminish the Hindu identity in the West. No surprises over there. But you also assert that within anti-Hinduism in the West, there's actually a kernel of anti-Brahminism, which I agree but don't know enough about. Can you shed some light on what's happening in terms of the anti-Brahminism? Well, I can't use that term. Can you shed some light on what is happening in terms of anti-Brahmin movement in the West, especially in America?
There are many fringe groups like Equality Labs that are promoting hatred for Brahmins on social media with impunity. These groups are implicitly supported by politicians who such as Ro Khanna, who want to prove their social justice credentials by providing sort of implicit support to these groups. And what they've been doing is, if you Google Equality Labs and you look at their Facebook posts or their Twitter posts, you can see lots of anti-Brahmin posters. They would say something like, destroy Brahminism. They would make all sorts of outlandish claims about how Brahmins are responsible for all the misfortunes or the ill treatment of the Dalits in India. They ascribe everything to the Brahmins. There's also, I don't know if you've heard of this term called Boston Brahmin. The term is used in a pejorative sense. The term Boston Brahmin basically refers to the elites in New England, and they're referred to as the Boston Brahmins. And basically, the idea is to associate these elites with the Brahmins of India. But the elites of New England were wealthy people, and the Brahmins of India had nothing to do with wealth, they were not wealthy, and that connection there is very weak. But there have been many instances in which the term Brahmin has been used in a pejorative sense, like that.
What's to be gained with tarnishing Brahmins or tarnishing Hindus, but especially tarnishing Brahmins in context of today's political climate?
Right. So these radical social justice groups, what they're trying to do is to jump on this bandwagon of white privilege. And they basically want to associate the Brahmins in Hinduism with the refer to the Brahmins in Hinduism as actually, let me restate it. They basically want to equate the Brahmin with the whites in America as the privileged class. and associate the Dalits with the blacks in America. So the Brahmins become the whites of Hinduism, and the Dalits become the blacks of Hinduism. And this is a very superficial and baseless comparison. It doesn't hold any water, because the Brahmins are a minority with no economic or political clout, whether it's in India or in America. Whites, on the other hand, are the majority and do possess economic and political power. So such generalizations are baseless. And in fact, such generalizations are baseless because, not all whites possess economic or political power. So, the sort of the radical social justice movement wants to label certain segments of the population as being privileged. And so they try to make these broad generalizations about these groups. And so they're working very hard to tie the Brahmins with the whites in America. And that's a very tenuous comparison.
So it certainly now makes a whole lot more sense to me. And I guess the picture I'm drawing in my head is that while there's this anti-white sentiment, this conversation which is often associated with violence and riots about white privilege, while that is perhaps only picking up as we speak, the anti-India, anti-Hindu political forces in the West, especially in the United States, are hijacking the movement in the sense that they are now associating well-tested anti-Brahmin sentiment from India, bring it to the West, draw a parallel between the oppression of the Indian society at the hand of Brahmins, which is highly debatable, and casting it along the same storyline in the United States, and hence make their movement global. And while they are, in their words, taking care of the white privilege in the United States, they are basically globalizing their movement and want to take the same sentiment in India as well and destabilize India.
That's correct. There's supposed to be in America, there's not supposed to be any discrimination based on race, gender, religious affiliation, or other personal traits. However, groups like Equality Labs are trying to create a scenario where it's okay to demonize and discriminate against certain groups that they view as privileged. And the Brahmins, who they equate with the whites of America, are a group that they think should be discriminated against and demonized.
Well, Venkat, this was quite helpful. So thankful that you shed light on this subject that at least was not on my radar, or at least as high up on my radar. And thank you for elaborating a bit of the historical perspective and connecting the dots between what happened in India and how it is being reattempted in the American context. So I thank you very much for taking time to do that. And I would want to continue this conversation on anti-Brahmin sentiment and build upon it to understand how it has basically started to make inroads into many aspects of our social lives, especially in corporate America as well, and how it threatens the hard work that has been done by Indians in this country, how it tarnishes their image, and ultimately how it destabilizes India and Hindus in general. So thank you again for taking the time, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, and namaste, Rajiv.
Namaste.